The Premier's big pipeline push, the politics around energy and the relationship with Ottawa, and how that may be distracting us from other important conversations in Alberta. That's next on the Line Alberta Podcast. All right, well, welcome to The Line Alberta. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast this week as we delve into a conversation around the politics of pipelines, Alberta's relationship with Ottawa, and maybe the distraction that provides from certain other issues. Very pleased to welcome to The Line Alberta Max Fawcett, lead columnist for the National Observer, nationalobserver.com. Max, great to have you with us here. So it was quite a week last week for a number of reasons, I guess. But do you think it was a coincidence that, the week the Premier chooses to make this big pipeline splash happens to be the same week that the whole teachers thing blows up?
No, I think everything she does is done with that sort of planning in mind, and obviously wanted a way to change the channel away from this labor dispute, which could go against the government. It could go against the teachers. I don't think we know right now, but she definitely knows that playing the Ottawa card, it goes well almost every time for her government. And so, the thing that I was most surprised by was the tweet that she put out a couple of weeks ago, where she seemed to be speaking positively about the negotiations with Ottawa and with Mark Carney around pipelines. I found that to be very out of character. And so the announcement about the pipeline and basically putting the ball back in Ottawa's court kind of feels like a return to regularly scheduled programming here in Alberta.
To me, it kind of serves as a reminder of how different things would be if, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives had won the federal election, because all these things that maybe the Premier would prefer not talk about, she'd have no choice. There would be this none of this. Alberta Next, all of it would just be completely off the table.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that the Premier popped up a few times during the federal election and said things that were not super duper helpful for Pierre Poilievre. I mean, you can never prove that she was trying to, low bridge him, but that was the net effect. And you're right. If Poilievre had been elected, the whole tone would have changed. The government, I think, would have still spent a lot of time blaming Justin Trudeau and Ottawa and the Liberals, but it wouldn't have been as effective. And now she has that card available to play. And I think the really interesting question is, how does Mark Carney respond to, the ball being served into his court? Because he said that he wanted to see shovel-ready projects. He wanted to see a pipeline that was, I think, more fully conceived than what she has brought to the table. But he, I don't think, can afford to say no without looking, at least in Alberta, and maybe that doesn't matter as much as other parts of the country, but he would look like he isn't serious when he says it's time to build, it's time to get our products to market. I would hope and suspect that he will put some asks on the table for the Premier. That she talks about this grand bargain. I think there's been sort of an acceptance that there is a grand bargain out there around pipelines for climate policy, for support for the carbon capture projects and maybe industrial carbon pricing. I'd like to see him make that explicit and kind of put the ball back in her court and say, look, we're happy to get behind a pipeline project, but you have to hold up your end of our bargain. We need to see that bargain, I think, sketched out a little more fully. And she has taken the initiative here in a way that is, I think, very on brand for her politically.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, you alluded to where the tone was at, a month ago, and when the two met and they were both kind of gushing about each other and where things were at. Because I think there is the political upside of getting a win or being able to show that she delivered on something big like this. But there's the political upside of fighting with Ottawa and having that scapegoat. Are these two things at odds at times?
I think there's tension there, but I agree with you that this is sort of a win-win for her politically. If she gets federal support for Northern Gateway 2.0, then she can absolutely say that was her. She did that. She held the federal government's feet to the fire and got them to do something they never would have done otherwise. And if they don't, she gets to say, look, it's the same old people. It's the same old party. We tried, we did our best. And now it's time to go down another road. I happen to think that road is incredibly dangerous. I think it's been, and we can get into this in a second, I think it's been risky for her to flirt so openly with this Pandora's box that other politicians in other parts of the country have had a hard time closing. But, in the near term, strategically, I don't really see much downside here for her, especially with the NDP really not knowing how to play its cards here. Naheed Nenshi came out with a statement sort of basically saying, well, yeah, we're for pipelines, but she hasn't pipelined hard enough. And they're just never going to win any ballot issue that is framed around pipelines. And it's bizarre to me that they haven't found a way to talk about this and a way to communicate around this that isn't sort of a kind of UCP light positioning. It doesn't put them in good stead for whenever the next election comes. So, the substance of what she's doing, I really don't agree with, and I think it's dangerous on a lot of levels, but the politics are pretty impeccable.
Well, yeah. I mean, the pipeline politics right now, I mean, it seems like that's kind of become paramount, like front and center. Like it's really all about this. If Alberta gets a yes on a pipeline, I think a lot of this other Alberta Next stuff, it just kind of falls by the wayside. It doesn't matter as much. And like you say, if it's a no, if the Liberals say no to Alberta, well, then, I think in a lot of ways, all bets are off.
Yeah. And where those bets go and how they pay out is I suppose, a question that must be on Mark Carney's mind. Sure. And I'm sure Danielle Smith has pointed that out to him. I believe they're talking today when we're recording. So, I'm sure she will remind him that the stakes here are different than they have been in previous pipeline, call it negotiations with Ottawa. And she is playing her hand, as she tends to, very, very strategically. And I think, obviously, Mark Carney has been distracted by bigger issues. Certainly, he's going down to Washington to have another chat with Donald Trump. But he does have to start playing his cards, I think, a little more intentionally here. He can't let himself get boxed in the way I think he has here by Premier Smith, where, she is framing the issue. She is making it seem, that she is doing the work. She has, brokered a compromise, and now it's all on Ottawa, when in reality, Alberta hasn't done any of the things that it should be doing if it wants to get a pipeline built. Like, that's the thing that's most striking to me here is if you were drawing up a strategy to get a new pipeline built, you would not do it the way Danielle Smith has done it. It is almost the exact opposite. You would have the conversations with Indigenous leaders and communities in BC first. You would try to win over David Eby some way, somehow first. You would have a route. You would have a proponent. You would do all these things first, because we've seen this story before with Gateway the first time. If you try to basically present a plan to leaders in BC, Indigenous leaders, political leaders, they will say no. They need to co-create it with you. And so it almost makes me feel like she is doing this in this way because she knows it will get a no from those people, and it will allow her to play the anti-Ottawa card. It kind of feels like she's engineering a no rather than a yes, because that is what is most advantageous to her politically. And that worries me.
Well, yeah, so we try to make sense of what the purpose of that announcement was last week, especially in the context of it seeming like things were progressing with the prime minister that's open to this kind of a project. Was it to put pressure on him? Was it to reframe the conversation? I think, as you say, then there was a lot of strategy involved in that. Yeah,
absolutely. It was very political, and that's fine. She's a politician. That's what they do. But it does not feel to me like the behavior of someone whose top priority is getting to yes on a pipeline. And if you're someone who that is your top issue, if that's the thing that you think, will really benefit the province, unlock the province's economy, I mean, we can have a conversation about that. But if that is your position, what she's doing is not helpful. It is helpful for her politically. It is not helpful for the province. And again, the NDP, I think, could be out there making that argument. And for some reason, they are making a completely different argument.
If we sort of deluded ourselves, sort of the collective we in Alberta, and maybe, but in some ways, the federal government has played into this by touting this major projects office as this kind of shortcut to prosperity. That somehow this is now easy. All the problems we run into in the past, all the things that derailed Northern Gateway, well, now all of a sudden we have this magic shortcut. Because I don't think that's the reality, is it?
No, it's not, and I do think I think we naturally gravitate towards solutions that seem easier rather than work that seems harder. And I think it's a very nice idea. It's certainly one that conservatives mostly in Alberta have nurtured for a long time, which is that if the federal government really wanted to push a pipeline through BC, it could. It had the legislative authority. It could use the declaratory power, or it could override provincial pushback in BC. And that's just not how it works. It's the Constitution doesn't work that way. Certainly the courts don't see it that way. But there is this belief that if there was a will, there would be a way. And we kind of seem to be back in that place where it seemed to be an issue of willpower. And I think willpower is important. I think we saw willpower with the previous Liberal team in terms of TMX. That required a lot of willpower, and it cost them a lot of seats and votes in BC. But there is a limit to what willpower can do, especially in northern BC, especially given the unique legal terrain up there that the Supreme Court has acknowledged in previous rulings. And I genuinely don't understand why that still seems to be new information in some circles here in Alberta. The Indigenous communities in Alberta are not the same as BC. They have different legal relationships with the Crown, with governments. And I thought that lesson would have been learned with Gateway, and it doesn't seem to have been learned and may have to be relearned here again, unfortunately.
Well, it's just maybe Alberta just looking to put all of this on Ottawa, that we'll make the announcements and then Ottawa can do all the heavy lifting.
Yeah, exactly. And I wrote a column laying out what, if Danielle Smith really wanted to get a pipeline built, what she could and would have done. And it's more than just saying we've got the backing of pipeline companies and we want to get to Tidewater. She would, I think, for starters, offer to cover, let's say, all the cleanup costs of any oil spill in BC. That is a huge concern among Indigenous communities there, among coastal communities. And the Alberta government has always kind of brushed that off as like, it's not a real risk. There's not going to be spills. And I've even had arguments with folks where I haven't taken that position, but I have pointed out the data shows that the risk is pretty low, but low is not good enough for those communities, especially, fishing communities, traditional communities, where that would, a spill, if it happened, however low probability, would wipe them out, would wipe out their economic livelihood. And so I think the province has to come out and say, we'll cover all the costs to everyone. No wrangling, no, we'll pay you in 20 years. We're offering to cover everything up front if it happens. That would go a long way. And I think another thing that would go a long way is reaching out to those Indigenous communities, not in Alberta, but in BC, and saying, we're going to make you owners of this project, and not 1% or 2%. They would own a majority of the project. I think that would open the conversation up. I think that would be, one of those sort of Michael Corleone, an offer you can't refuse situations. Yeah. But she hasn't made that offer. The only offer she's made is we're going to rattle our saber at Ottawa again and see if it goes differently for us. And maybe that works politically. But again, if you're someone who cares most about getting a pipeline built, her strategy is not a good strategy.
Well, it's interesting because when you look on the LNG side, it's really interesting to see what's happened in BC, where you've got the BC government on board, Alberta, of course, on board, Ottawa on board, First Nations on board. We've now got a green light for this new project that is owned by First Nations. So in a way, that can be a model. I know a bitumen pipeline is different in a lot of ways, but is that kind of an example of maybe what this could look like? Absolutely.
I thought it was really interesting when David Eby came out and was quite clear that he wanted no part of this new pipeline project. He said part of the reason is because it would threaten, the relationship with coastal First Nations who have supported LNG and would threaten additional LNG projects up there. He was sort of saying, hey, please be careful here, because this is not like Gateway first time around where there was nothing really at stake from the oil and gas industry's perspective. You could be threatening your own interest in terms of additional LNG capacity there, because coastal First Nations could say, you know what? Enough. None of this. We're not going to support any of this. So I do think there's something they can learn from that relationship with those communities there. They want jobs, they want economic development, they want prosperity, but they don't want crumbs. They want to be owners. They want to be meaningful participants in it. And I don't think that they see that the risk is worth the reward. I think that is a rational calculation on their part, especially when you consider the impacts of an oil spill up there versus a gas spill. A gas spill, it's not great, but it mostly evaporates into the air. An oil spill is devastating to sort of intercoastal waters, to fisheries, to tourism, to all these industries that Indigenous communities there depend on. And you have to make it worth their while. They're not stupid. And I still think that the Alberta government is not treating them like they're stupid, but not giving them the respect they deserve, and not treating them like full participants in this conversation.
In terms of where you think the Prime Minister's at on this, because like we say, he's signaled an openness to this, by bringing in Tim Hodgson, Don Farrell, those are signals too. But what do you think he wants in the end? And is he prepared to greenlight a pipeline? And what would he need in return, do you think?
I think he is. I think his approach here is meaningfully different from the previous Liberal government in terms of how he sees it. But I think he needs to see something coming back the other way, right? The whole idea of a grand bargain. I've thought for as long as he's sort of been involved, when he put his name in the ring to be leader of the Liberal Party, I thought the emissions cap was toast, the consumer carbon price was toast, and that he was going to set his flag, set his sail to the industrial carbon price, because he understands this issue probably better than any politician in Canada. And he understands the value of the industrial carbon price, not just for industry in terms of getting it on the path that he thinks it needs to get on, but for trading with other countries. Europe has a border carbon tax. Britain's bringing one in. Theoretically, America at some point could as well. Like that is the direction of travel for large industrial exports. And he understands the value of keeping and strengthening that industrial carbon price. So I think he wants to see Alberta stop undercutting it, stop low bridging it, stop diluting it, which it has done consistently since 2019, and finally get on board with it. And that would be the price, I think. And he'd be willing to get rid of the emissions cap. He would be willing, I think, to meaningfully modify the tanker ban. I suspect it would be something along the lines of, any project that has full support of coastal First Nations gets an exemption, something like that. Right. But he's got to get something coming back. It has to be a bargain. I see the CEO of Enbridge giving a speech in Toronto recently where he's talking about how the feds have to get rid of everything, including the industrial carbon price. And I think their understanding of what a bargain is just a really big discount. And that's not the bargain that Mark Carney must have in mind. I think he needs to get something in order for it to be a win for him, because otherwise, he has 2 seats right now in Alberta. Maybe he wins 3 or 4. He'll lose all of his seats in BC if he tries to ram something through there. I still don't think politicians and industry folks in Alberta remember or realize how unpopular Gateway was. Gateway got the BC Liberals offside, and BC Liberals are mostly conservatives. It was incredibly unpopular. And, David Eby would probably go to a snap election on that issue. It just would polarize the electorate there. And he has 20 seats there. He can't afford to lose 20 seats, especially if it's not going to win him 20 seats back in Alberta. So there has to be an actual bargain. There has to be an actual exchange of things of value. And if there isn't, I think he'll walk away from it.
Well, carbon capture is an interesting factor here. I don't know if BC necessarily cares about it or coastal First Nations necessarily care about it, but I think the Liberals do. I think it's a bargaining chip from Alberta's perspective as well. Where does this fit in the Pathways project in particular?
It's definitely a key part of that. And so industrial carbon pricing fits into that. Those projects are way harder to justify economically if there's no industrial carbon price. But I think Carney sees things kind of the way I see things, which is our climate policies are not going to impact global demand, right? We're not responsible. We can't be, we can't displace the emissions associated with combustion, because if we don't produce those fossil fuels, and I know this is a frustrating argument for climate advocates, but unfortunately, it's just the way the world works. Someone else will. There's a global cartel that can withhold supply. There's spare capacity out there. If we shut in our barrels to do things for the climate, they'll just get produced somewhere else. So all we can do is reduce the upstream emissions. And that's what we should do, 100%. That should be our focus. And I think that is Carney's focus. That is his government's focus, is let's zero out those upstream emissions as much as possible. And that's where carbon capture and storage comes in. The previous Liberal regime offered a 50% tax credit. It's pretty good. I understand where the companies are coming from in saying this is something that doesn't generate any revenue for them. It's all cost. And so there has to be support. I think the Alberta government has to increase its offer. It's only offering 12%. And I think it would be nice if they match the federal offer. At the very least, they have to increase it to get those projects across the line. And, I've heard from some folks who have pointed out that, some of the carbon capture projects out there, whether they're in Norway, the United States, or Saskatchewan, the results so far have not been as promised. And I hear them. I agree. I would simply point out that tends to be the case for a lot of early stage technologies. If you look at the earlier days of wind and solar, the numbers were not great. But the fact of the matter is, with government support, they scaled, they learned, the technology got better, and now we're in a place where wind and solar, especially solar, are kind of unbeatable in terms of their economics. And I think carbon capture can get there if it has the support and the time to work out the kinks. And that, that's a place where the Alberta government has to come in. It's a place where the federal government is already there. And it's how we can do the things we need to do on climate. We're never going to be able to zero out all the emissions, but we can zero out our portion of them.
Yeah. And the economic hopes being pinned on this kind of a pipeline project, because, and that's certainly the focus of the Major Projects Office. We saw with TMX, takes a lot of people to build these projects. There's certainly a revenue upside for governments. But I think, as we saw too, the Imperial Oil layoffs, that we have an industry that is able to increase production without necessarily increasing its workforce. So what do we make of the economics of a project like this?
I think the idea that it's going to be transformative is really overblown. And I'll give you a couple of reasons why. The first one is, the impact that TMX had on the differential between Canadian and America, or, WTI and WCS, was considerable. There's a lot of folks out there saying, it's not going to make that much of a difference. Guess what? It did. And that has meant billions of dollars already to the Alberta Treasury. It's meant billions of dollars to the federal Treasury. I broke this down in my Substack. But that's not necessarily going to be the case for the next pipeline. You can't just sort of say, well, it happened for TMX, so let's just assume the same for Gateway 2.0. Alberta Central, which is, I guess, the economic forecasting wing of the credit unions in our province, did a really good analysis here. And they said it's not going to be the same impact because the differential has been narrowed basically to the level where it's now just quality differences and transportation costs. Those aren't going to go away. Like, a new pipeline doesn't make it, doesn't change the quality of our oil as far as refineries are concerned. And it doesn't mean that it's free to transport it to those refineries. That differential is always going to be there to a certain extent. So we need to be careful not to read those numbers in that were there for TMX. And then we also need to remember, like you said, with Imperial, like, these companies are getting very good at replacing human beings with technology. They have been signaling this for a long time. It is not just in Canada. I think there's a temptation in Alberta to say, well, Imperial did those layoffs because of those darn Liberals. But guess what? The exact same cuts are being made in the States right now with Donald Trump in office. ConocoPhillips has announced massive layoffs. ExxonMobil, the parent company of Imperial, basically, similar layoffs. This is happening everywhere because these oil companies have to find ways to reduce costs. And they're doing it with technology. Suncor had been telling us for a long time they were going to replace the people driving their big hauler trucks with autonomous vehicles. They did it. And now a lot of those jobs are gone forever. And so we need to have a conversation in this province about what the oil industry looks like in the future and what that means for the economy. We can't just assume that if we build another pipeline, if we build another big oil sands project, it's going to be the same as 2014. It won't be. These projects are way less human capital intensive. They're way less labor intensive. And the read through to the broader economy is just smaller. So it doesn't mean they're not a good thing to do. I think, from the federal government's perspective, the value of a pipeline is in many ways symbolic. It is symbolic of the fact that we can do hard things in this country. We are not a country where you can't build things. I think that has value across the country and across the economy. But we need a conversation in Alberta about the industry as it is, not as we wish it was or as we remember it being, because it is not that way anymore.
So last week left us with a little bit of a cliffhanger on that front. We'll see what happens between now and Grey Cup. A little bit of a cliffhanger too on the whole Alberta Next process. What comes of all of this? Where does this all go? What was the point of it? It was a weird way to end things last week with this really weird exchange with the moderator and a young person in attendance. I mean, it's pretty clear that this was supposed to only be about bashing Ottawa, and they really weren't favorable to any kind of critique of their own government. But I don't know, just looking back now that we've seen all these town halls, what did you make of this process, and what next for Alberta Next?
I think we saw one of the most expensive push polls ever conducted, and it was conducted with taxpayer money. From the very beginning, this was not an exercise in finding out what people thought. It was an exercise in changing the way people thought and in managing the way people thought. And, like you said, you saw that with the way the moderator behaved. It wasn't just at the Calgary event. It would happen throughout the course of the panel, where people who agreed with the government's position were given time and oxygen, and people who were critical of it were cut off and minimized. And I heard someone on LinkedIn who's done a lot of panels. He said something very wise. He said, the job of a moderator is to serve the audience. You work for the audience, not the panel. And it was the other way around with Alberta Next. The Bruce McAllister clearly worked for the panel. He clearly had an agenda, and it was to advance the government's position on these things. So where does that leave us? I don't think they changed many people's minds. I don't get the sense that there is widespread support for an Alberta pension plan or an Alberta police force, and I don't get the sense that the government is changing course on any of that. I think they heard a lot of criticism, and I think they're still plowing ahead. I think they're going to put at least a couple of these measures on the ballot next year. I think I would guess probably an Alberta police force, because they seem like they're doing that already. Mm-hmm. I think they'll do the Alberta pension plan, even though, I just don't see the appetite for that there. Maybe they'll leave a couple of the more controversial or just frankly stupid ones, like collecting our own income taxes. I don't see any reason why we would pay a bunch of money and hire a bunch of public servants to file 2 income taxes in this province. There were some folks at the panel who suggested that we would control more revenue. That's not how it would work. We would have to remit everything to Ottawa that was Ottawa. So, and I didn't hear that. I didn't hear the moderator clap back on that. But, look, this government is very good at being attentive to the comms side of their remit. They're very attentive to public relations and communications, and that kind of fits for who the premier is. The premier is a communicator. She's a former radio host. She understands how to talk to people and how to make them feel like they've been heard, even if they haven't been heard. But I don't think this changes the calculus around support for separation. I don't think this has made the separatists feel like, well, we're good. We can go back and leave this issue alone. I think they are going to look to matters of substance. And if the pipeline doesn't get approved by Ottawa, I think they will be back at the ramparts. I think in some respects, this has raised their expectations in giving them all this time and attention, and in kind of really gently coddling their feelings and their worldview. I think it has validated it. And I think if they don't see it put through into action, into policy by the government of Alberta, they may just end up being twice as angry as they were before. And I'm not sure that you can put this genie back in the bottle. And I see Jason Kenney out there criticizing it. Thank you for that, sir. I think it's important to note that he was the one that let it out of the bottle in the first place. The first, fair deal panel. That's where this kind of got kicked off. Jen Gerson, obviously your boss, but your colleague at the line, I think she had a very good column on that front, that this accomplishes nothing. Except distracting Albertans from the things that the Alberta government can actually do. And it might be better if we focused on those things, but of course, that's not in the best interests of the UCP. And so here we are.
Yeah. It's funny because it's a bit of a paradox in a way, and perhaps a bit of a dilemma for the government here, because I think in general terms, and especially amongst UCP supporters, the idea of Alberta doing more and making these decisions, and they're more accountable to us because we obviously can't change the government in Ottawa, that has support. But when you go down the list, okay, how about a pension plan? No thanks. How about a provincial police force? The revenue agency? Like there's little enthusiasm for these specific individual ideas, but the sort of broad theme still does seem to resonate with people.
It does. And, I think it's interesting the way the conservative movement is evolving. It's not just here. I think you see it in the United States as well. But I don't see a lot of fiscal conservatives anymore because all of these ideas, with the possible exception of the Alberta pension plan, are not fiscally conservative. You're talking about hiring more government employees. You're talking about more red tape, more bureaucracy, but in the name of more control. And this is of a piece with the Danielle Smith government. She has increased spending more in 2 years than the NDP did in all 4. And look, if this is the road they want to go down and this is the road that voters support, fair enough. But I do think it's worth having a conversation about the way in which conservatism in Alberta is evolving before our very eyes. I don't put much stock in having my taxes collected by a public servant in Alberta. But again, if that's something that people want, then we can pay for it. The whole essence of politics at the end of the day is figuring out what people want and how they want to pay for it. And in some respects, I don't want to say I admire the conversation that Danielle Smith has triggered here, but it has value. I just don't think she's particularly interested in owning the consequences of it. And those consequences are, I think, coming due fairly shortly. Alberta can do more, absolutely, but it comes at a cost. Are we willing to pay it? Or are we just looking for new ways to blame Ottawa? Feels like that's kind of where we're at.
It's interesting, too. I mean, Thomas Lukaszuk and his petition effort, the Forever Canadian effort, it actually looks plausible now, if not likely, that they can get to this 300,000 target by the end of October, which would also imply that the separatists could probably reach that lower threshold. They're, of course, tied up in the courts, and it's an open question, I guess, what might come of that. Where do things stand right now, do you think, on this whole question of referendum on separation?
It's very interesting because, I didn't realize this until I read about it recently, but I guess the way that Lukaszuk's and his group's petition is structured, they have said and basically encouraged the government to simply hold a vote in the legislature on it.
Right.
That would satisfy their concerns, that the issue be debated in the legislature, voted on, and put to bed. And that's an interesting idea because it kind of forces Danielle Smith to pick a side. She's been very careful not to pick a side here. She claims that she's a federalist. She's fighting for Canada, but she needs to hear these people out. And she's trying to play both sides of the field. And if his petition is successful, and I still don't think the math can work, but I'm open to being proven wrong. I see his volunteers everywhere. Then it would kind of preempt any actual referendum. And I think that would be good. I think that would be healthy. I think having an actual referendum on this issue is very damaging economically, first and foremost. I think the example of Quebec shows us very clearly that once you open the door to this, it is very bad for business. It is very bad for trying to attract capital to the province because it just creates an uncertainty that is always there in people's minds that this thing could kick up again, that it could gain wind again, and we would be once again spending all of our time debating constitutional issues rather than simply trying to run a business, and business doesn't like that. So it's odd to me that a nominally pro-business party is willing to risk this. But to me, it's been clear from the start that Danielle Smith, her theory of politics is, I will not be defeated the way Jason Kenney was defeated. I will not lose to my party's membership. I may lose in a general election. I think she's willing to she's perfectly willing to face that fate, but she was not going to lose in a party vote. And that's why she's done all this, this sort of quasi-separatist stuff. It's why she's opened the door to the separatists in her party, which I think at this point are probably a majority of UCP members, and is, I think willing to live with the consequences of that. I just don't think the consequences are great for the rest of us. And at some point, I think she is going to have to decide what is more important, her own political career or her province's political future. I don't know how she's going to come down on that issue.
Some interesting weeks ahead. Much more is mentioned, nationalobserver.com. Max Fawcett, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for making time.
Yeah, thanks for the chat, Rob. That was good.
All right, and our thanks once again to Max Fawcett, lead columnist at the National Observer. He's based in Calgary. Again, you can read him at nationalobserver.com, including his latest, laying out the case for a different approach from Danielle Smith. If she really wants to get a pipeline approved by Ottawa, here's the steps that Alberta should be taking. And it's an interesting question. Does Danielle Smith prefer a partnership with Ottawa or a fight with Ottawa? Because if she can convince the Premier or the Prime Minister to say yes to a pipeline, that is a win, I think, in a lot of ways for her, but it does make a lot of these other issues kind of fall by the wayside. So it's going to be an interesting few weeks, both here in Alberta and nationally. Again, the expectation from the Premier that the Prime Minister has some kind of announcement to make on a pipeline project by Greg Kopp. And the Prime Minister has signaled that Greg Kopp would be the stage for him to announce the next phase of major projects. So maybe a lot could happen by then, but I think it's still an open question. Of course, we've got the Alberta legislature resuming later in October. I think the Premier is going to have to give some indication of where things are going in the aftermath of Alberta Next, what comes out of all of that, or was it just kind of an expensive venting session for Albertans? Or as Max Fawcett said, a bit of a push-pull by the government to try to drive public opinion on a few issues. And then, of course, there's the other matters that the Alberta government needs to attend to. We'll see what happens on the teachers' strike and how much that dominates the conversation once the legislature resumes, whether there's back to work legislation or anything along those lines. And some of these other more domestic issues that I think the Premier would prefer not be in the spotlights, right? They much prefer the conversation where we're talking about Ottawa, the relationship with Ottawa, how we're standing up to Ottawa. And these other issues that really have nothing to do with the feds are really not the issues that the Premier, I think, really wants at the forefront right now. So the Alberta legislature resumes later this month. And as we said, we'll maybe get some clarity in the coming weeks on where all of this is going. Of course, the end of the month, too, is the deadline for the Thomas Lukaszuk Group, Forever Canadian, to get their signatures in. They're about 80% of the way there from what we heard in recent days. And so they got to the end of the month to try to get their 300,000 signatures. And that will also give us some indication as to, are we going to see a referendum on the separation question? And how does the Premier choose to handle all of that? So some interesting weeks and perhaps months ahead. But that's where we will leave it for this episode of the Line Alberta Podcast. Don't forget, you can subscribe at alberta.readtheline.ca. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Again, thanks for joining us this week on the Line Alberta Podcast. We will talk to you next Wednesday. Take care.